Welcome, everyone. Thanks for spending time today with us. You're signed on to the second webinar of a four-part series, and the series is all about lead-generating webinars for manufacturing companies. It's a how-to series. This second webinar in the series will cover the first 4 steps of an 8-step framework designed for manufacturing companies to create, present, produce, and measure your own knowledge-based or education-based webinars. The next webinar will cover steps 5 through 8. So today we'll cover steps 1 through 4. And if you listen to the entire 4 webinar series, by the end of the series, you will be able to create and produce and execute and measure your own education-based webinars. And what we've seen with knowledge-based webinars where you teach your audience about something they care about, you will get hundreds, and we've seen even some cases where there's been thousands of people to register for these webinars wanting to hear about your knowledge and expertise. So that's what we're going to teach you in this series. It's not theoretical. We've practiced this with real audiences, so we know that it works. Okay, speaking today, my name is Bruce McDuffie. I'm the Principal Consultant for Knowledge Marketing for Industry, or KMI. I bring more than 20 years of experience in business-to-business sales and marketing in the industrial sector, and I've tested this concept of product-based webinars versus knowledge-based webinars, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that knowledge-based webinars will always outperform product webinars. And Dan Levy is your co-presenter today. Dan has also worked in industrial sectors as a marketing strategist and a content developer with 25 plus years of experience. And his career is all about helping manufacturers find their authentic stories and telling these stories in a way that engages and educates and enlightens customers. Dan's coming to us today from Nebraska, and I'm broadcasting today from Boulder, Colorado. So Dan, welcome. Thanks for coming out today, and Dan's going to kick us off with some housekeeping topics.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bruce. Yes, coming to you from the snowy Midwest today, as a matter of fact. But for every webinar you've ever been to, and if some of you on the line who have given webinars, you always want to start with the housekeeping. It's kind of an expected, almost ritual when you give a webinar. And typically these are the questions that folks are looking for. You know, will we get a copy of the recorded webinar, which in our case is yes. Can you ask questions? Gosh, please do. There's a question box in the lower left-hand corner that you can submit some questions to us. We'll try and answer them throughout, and if not, we've got a good Q&A section we've left at the end so that we can be sure to get those. And then will you be able to get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. The slides, the recorded presentation, we're going to make everything available to you because I think that's part and parcel of not only being a good webinar host, if you will, but making these 3 areas available, as well as any other additional supporting information you might have available, is not only a great convenience for those folks who are attending your webinars, but they're also a terrific measure of how successful you are. We'll talk about that later in the webinar today. But these 3 sort of housekeeping issues, I like to refer to them as the vital signs of your webinar, because they're going to give you a good sense not only as you're delivering it, but sort of before, during, and after of how people are receiving it. And so we'll get into that into more detail, but definitely our answer to these 3 questions is an emphatic yes, and it's something that you should consider as you're thinking about putting your webinars together as well. And Bruce, I think as you had alluded to in the beginning, we're going to talk about steps 1 through 4 today of the process. So why don't you kind of take us through a little bit as a setup what those are?
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Okay. Agenda today, we will cover the first 4 steps of the 8-step framework. And the first 4 steps, as you can see on the screen, number 1 is to collaborate with your stakeholders And this is the section where you take care of the foundations or the fundamentals. As with any marketing activity, or really any project at all, you always want to determine things like your objective, your audience, your topic, and we talked about the sweet spot topic in the last webinar, your metrics, what will success look like, how will you know if you've succeeded, and these are all things we'll cover in step 1, and you should cover in step 1 with your stakeholders. Step number 2, we'll talk about how you create the concept, about the face and the brand and the voice and so on that you want to put forward to your audience. Step 3, we'll talk about choosing the team, the different players you should have, the on voice or the speaker talent, as well as those behind the scenes. And then step number 4, we'll talk about the tools, because you'll need definitely tools for broadcasting the webinar, for promoting it, and for measuring results. That's what we'll cover today. And by the end of the webinar, we hope you can have these takeaways. Dan?
Absolutely. This is always my favorite part because this is almost a little bit of a challenge to Bruce and I to make sure we deliver on, but it's the value we want to provide you. And we're going to talk a lot about education and value today. So hopefully 45 to 55 minutes from now, you will have you'll feel like either you will have learned or you'll be more confident in these 3 areas. And the first one being how to collaboratively develop the topic, the audience, the metrics, and the resources for a successful foundation. We'll hit on all of those, but really how to set that up as a way to really guide the rest of your team as well as yourself in terms of what you're putting together for your webinar. Learn how to choose the best people for the webinar team, and I will be honest and confess, at least one quick story that I've got about that. It's not always obvious who the best people are. I had a client one time where we were doing a webinar, and we called the PR spokesperson. He's a great guy. He's got a great voice, terrific speaker in front of the media. And so we thought, well, he'll be a natural. And we put him up in the front of the webinars. And the problem is we couldn't ever really shake him out of PR spokesperson mode. And so we're working with him to get to be more conversational, but it just seemed like an obvious choice. But then once we got there, we kind of went, well, wait a minute, maybe not. So we'll talk a little bit about how to find the best people to help you out. And then we're also going to talk through a lot of the tools that are available that you can look for production, for broadcast, for promotion, and even conversion. There are some great tools out there because we understand that most of the folks who are out there doing content marketing right now are probably short-staffed. Content marketing, especially webinars, are new, and there are just a number of tools out there that can really help automate and make the job of webinar production and webinar success a lot easier. So we want to review those and talk about how to put them into play. But before we do that, there was from our last webinar, the first one we did. If you didn't have a chance to see it, it's worth the time. Please go check it out. But there was one key, and I credit Bruce for authoring this, so I'm going to let him take it away. But there was one key message that I think would be a great foundation to kind of kick us off to get into this webinar. So, Bruce, why don't you take that and run with it, and we'll get into the meat of it.
Okay. Yeah, we did the first webinar a few weeks ago, and the theme behind that webinar was choosing your topic. And the saying that I came up with is that product marketing fails where educational marketing sails. You can picture yourself skimming over the waves with your educational marketing webinars, knowledge-based webinars, succeeding, and maybe the product marketing is the old hulk in the background sinking to the bottom of the bay. But there is a continuation of the 2 webinars, and the first one we said gave you a checklist, and the checklist that we provided ties in very nicely with the 8-step framework. So check that out. We talked about finding your topic, and this is what we cover when you collaborate in step 1 about finding the topic. The topic can make or break your webinar success as far as people who are interested in listening to it. So it's very important to take a look at that topic, and we'll look at that again here in a couple of slides. And finally, we covered how you can tell your salespeople and your product people that you're not going to talk about their product. You're still going to be successful in engaging with the audience. If you missed that webinar, you can go to this link, webinars.knowledge.marketing, and you can get the slides and you can see the recording of that webinar and cover these things. It's a good background to cover the fundamentals. So step one. Step one is to collaborate, and you collaborate naturally with your webinar team, but you also want to collaborate with your sales team, your product marketing team, and maybe even your executives. If you can get an executive sponsor for this project, you'll be way ahead of the game because it's different. It's a different way of marketing for manufacturing companies. And it's different because we're educating instead of talking about features and benefits. So you need to cover the fundamentals. One of the fundamentals is the objective. As with any marketing activity, you should always ask the question, why are we doing this? And if you can't answer why are we doing this, then you shouldn't do it. So you have to ask that question, why are we doing this? Leads to the objectives and the goals. For example, it might be leads. If you are choosing leads as an objective, I've noticed that it's important to define and agree on the definition of a lead. Because if you don't agree on the definition and you have 10 people in the room, they're all going to have 10 different definitions in their heads. And they're all going to be different. Your objective may be awareness. It may be actual closed business. It may be re-engagement or waking up a dormant database. Whatever you choose as the objective, make sure you can measure it. Make sure you can know with the metrics if you achieved that objective. It doesn't make any sense to have an objective if at the end of the webinar series you don't know if you made it or not. Some supporting metrics that come built in with webinars are registrants, attendees, that conversion percentage from registrants to attendees, time spent actually on the webinar. You can set up a lead scoring algorithm. You can have a metric as actual sales calls generated from the webinar attendees or registrants, or you could have a true return on investment metric using opportunities created and if they were touched by the webinar. Whatever you choose, again, make sure you have metrics, and you should have agreement that when you sit down with your stakeholders at the end of the series and you say, here's why we're successful, you have achieved the objectives.
Hey, and Bruce, I wanted to jump in real quick, too, on the metrics.
Yeah,
Let me slide that back there real quick. You know, as you mentioned before, I come to this content marketing, webinars, et cetera, from the storytelling side. That's where my real interest is, kind of the journalism side of it. So, you know, as you had just gone through a couple of minutes ago and listed all the different kinds of metrics that are available out there, I know when I first got into this, again, being a story guy, being a writer, the metrics kind of can seem overwhelming because you can measure so many different things in so many different ways. And if you're either understaffed or you're a little bit like me and you're coming at it from the story side of things, please know that the tool, when we get to the tools section of this later on in the webinar, that's where those metrics really can start to be created very simply, and where you're going to get a number of different ways to look at a webinar and measure it in a way that makes sense to you. So as Bruce was giving that list, there's all kinds of great metrics, and if you're a number cruncher, these tools are going to be great for you too, because you're going to be able to crunch numbers till till you just can't take it anymore. So I just wanted to throw that out as a way of while the metrics are critically important to success, there are tools that are out there that will help you a great deal in figuring those out. So just didn't want if there are any story guys or people out there like me and you see numbers, you start to panic a little bit and get into a flop sweat. Don't worry about it. There are great tools out there to cover it. So anyway, thanks for letting me make that point.
Yeah, it's a great point, Dan. And, that's one of the reasons I love webinars as a pilot program for content marketing. Anytime you're going to shift the way companies market, you're going to do something different. Webinars are a great start because you can show those numbers. And if you can show that you had 500 or 1,000 people sign up for an educational or knowledge-based webinar, that gets attention, believe me.
Mm-hmm.
So the next section in collaboration is picking the target audience. And you want to choose an audience, whether it's by geography or by title or by industry or by company size, whatever it is. Obviously, someday you want them to be in a position to buy what you're selling, what you're offering. But the other thing to think about when you're choosing your audience is, can you reach them? You're going to create your webinar, and you're going to want to invite people and tell people about it. So if you pick an audience that you can't reach or you don't have a channel into, it's not going to work. You want to select an audience, ideally, the best audience is your existing database. And most companies have a database anywhere from 10, 20, or 40,000 people. That's your best audience because they've already contacted you at one time or another. You can also use associations where your potential audience or prospective customers congregate. Just find someplace so you can reach them by purchasing outbound time or purchasing marketing in front of them, or even the inbound opportunity. And your audience should have a common pain or a common passion that your expertise can address. And we'll look at that one in the next slide here when you're choosing your topic. So we went through this on the last one where we have the intersection of the pain or passion of your target audience, which we just mentioned, and the expertise of your firm. And the expertise is not your product. Granted, we're all experts at building our product, but that's not what we're going to talk about. So when you select the topic, the first thing you'll hear from your stakeholders, especially if they're sales or product people, is, yeah, this is a great idea. We're going to teach them all about our product and our company and tell them we have to teach them why it's so great. That's wrong. You have to push back on that right away and talk about the challenge they face or the pain or the passion they face, where your experts can help them relieve the pain or fan the passion. That's the key when you're selecting the topic. And again, go back and look at the first webinar. We go through that in quite a bit of detail. The topic should be relevant to your audience, of course. It should be useful. It should be helpful. If you can present a topic that helps your audience to be better at something, that's a winner. And again, resist the demand from your stakeholders to make it about product, because it will fail. You'll also want to agree with your stakeholders what happens after the webinar. Broadcasting the live webinar is only the beginning. Your real engagement happens at the end. Typically with a webinar, even one with a very hot topic, you might get 50% of the people who register to actually attend. So the other 50% are saying, hey, we're interested in this, but we didn't have time to attend. So you engage with them and you agree with your stakeholders how you will do that. At the very least, you want to send out an email that says either, sorry you missed the webinar, here's a link to the recording, or thanks for attending, and again, here's a link to the recording. But you may have an agreement with sales. Maybe the agreement is that everybody who attended or registered will get a phone call from sales. Now that's a bit aggressive, but that may be what you want to do. You may agree that every registrant will go through a lead scoring algorithm, and everyone who pops up with a certain score will get a call or get a follow-up. You could add them to a further nurturing program, or you could send an email from the sales reps on their behalf, which is always, I found, a good tactic to do. So agree on what happens after the webinar. This is really where you can mine the gold of an effective webinar. And you're going to need resources. You're going to need a commitment from resources. It's going to be money. You're going to need money because it's going to cost a little bit to use a webinar platform and maybe promote it. But even more importantly is the time. You're probably going to have experts who are not in the marketing department, and they have another job to do all day long. So they're going to have to carve out some time from their regular day to devote to your webinar series as the experts and or as the speaker. So it's important to get that commitment. You might have to go to their boss or their boss's boss and get a commitment of time. But you don't want to do it behind the scenes. I've seen some companies where they sort of sneak it in, and an expert says, yeah, I really want to do this, but I can't tell my boss, so we'll have to do it over lunch. You don't want to do that. You want it to be upfront, clear, that the resources are committed. That's very important. Step 2 is where you talk about the concept and the face you want to put forward, and Dan is going to take us through that step. Dan?
And just for the record, that is not my face, but that is certainly a face that connotes an emotion and certainly sets a tone. And you want to have that same thing happen with your webinar, because you definitely want to be true to your brand and in your position, certainly. But at the same time, you also want to be conversational. You want to get away from the corporate speak and just have a conversation. And sometimes conversations can be fun, and sometimes conversations, the language and the wording cannot always be managed by your legal department or the brand police at your particular organization. So we need to find a kind of a balance there. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. But at the same time, there are two other things that your webinars, you're thinking about the concept and the face and the tone. It definitely needs to support the topic. Probably that's going to be the biggest driver of anything, is how is what we're putting together going to support the topic. And if you let that be your driver, you'll have pretty good success. But the other thing, too, that I want to mention, and I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide, is what I call the B2B trap, or the business-to-business marketing trap that a lot of people fall into, and that, frankly, I think can really kill a webinar before it even has a chance. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's get into a little bit of the sort of the specifics of what we're talking about here. So the first thing that I want you to do as you're thinking about your webinar is think about the content that you're putting together as a valuable product or a valuable service that you are providing to your attendees, whether they be prospects or customers or whomever they are. It's just a service that you're not charging for. So as you think about how you're going to package this and the tone that you're going to put with it, if you think about it in those terms, we found that to be very helpful in the past, and it's been a great way to market that. I want to draw your attention to the picture down here in the lower right-hand corner. Let me grab the little arrow here. There we go. That picture right here. This was a marketing piece for a webinar that Bruce and I actually worked on together. And the topic was a fairly serious topic, but what we found in working with Craig and Emmy and Nate that you see pictured there is they're actually wonderful people. They've got great senses of humor. They're very passionate about their topic, and they really enjoy talking about it. So even though the topic of aviation safety, which is what they were talking about and what they're experts in, is a pretty serious topic, we were able to sort of tap into their personalities so that while the topic itself was serious, we were able to present it in a way that was very engaging, and a way that was very conversational, and in a way that was really created great two-way interaction during our webinars together. So while it was certainly in what we did here was very brand specific, we also incorporated their faces so that we could have some fun and really leverage their personalities. So that's just a point that I wanted to make as we get into. So let's start looking at some of these bullets here very quickly. Create a compelling name for the series. Again, just as you would brand a product. Make it easy. Make it fun. Make it something that's memorable as you put it together. Choose the titles of each webinar. And being benefit-oriented in this title, I think, is very important. But I also think, at least in my experience, clarity has been very important. We did a couple of webinars where we had a few folks check out a little bit early and leave a comment that said, well, I thought from your title this webinar was going to be about this other completely different topic. So that was kind of my fault for not being as clear as possible in naming the webinars so that we were very clear on what we were delivering and what people could expect. The third bullet, create a 100-word description for each. You don't want to go into a big, long description because then suddenly it becomes a blog and it's not a webinar anymore. But really, this is the place where you can really shine to talk about the value that you want to provide the attendee. This is what you're going to get if you give us an hour of your time in exchange. This is what you're going to get. And even in this webinar series that Bruce and I have worked on, our goal was really to help give you a framework to have great webinar success. And so while that was our objective, as Bruce was talking about earlier, get the teams together and set your objective, that was our objective. Very quickly we're able to turn that same objective around and make it into a benefit statement that we used in promoting the webinars. So you can do the same thing there. Take that objective, take that goal, and say, here's what we want to do for you. The fourth bullet, will you create a brand around a series? You may want to do, as Bruce mentioned earlier, just a one webinar pilot program, but you still may want to think of it beyond just the one webinar because if you get good response, you may want to suddenly take this idea of one webinar and work it into a series of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, or maybe it's an ongoing series that maybe lives for a couple of years. We've seen that happen. And the other thing is if you do put together a webinar and it is successful, you may want to reintroduce or maybe re-promote an encore version of it at some point. And so having that brand built around the series, or at least to be thinking in those terms early on, is really very important and can help promote the success later on as you build what you want to do with webinars. And then finally, the last one, create templates, slides for emails, for landing pages. We're all content, especially in the area of webinars, blogs, podcasts, etc. The world is starting to fill up with content. So one of the ways that you can help to make yours stand out, or at least ensure that it does, is consistency and creating a unique identity for your webinar. And again, that kind of goes to the point above, too. If you're going to build a brand around it, you want to make sure that when they see that first email where you're asking them to come to your webinar, and then they maybe see it again on your website, and maybe they're getting reminders once they register, when they download the slides, when they view the recording, if there are any follow-up materials, that all really ties together in a nice, unique, ownable brand. That will help your webinar attendees immediately identify with, oh yeah, this is what I want, this is what I need, almost at first sight. So when you do all of the things that are listed here on those 5 bullet points there, you avoid, number one, you do a great job of making sure that you support the topic. But number 2, you start to pull yourself out of what I had mentioned earlier, the sort of business-to-business marketing trap. It feels like a number of you, at least, that we're seeing here are probably going to be business-to-business marketers. And that can be so dull and boring, and it's just features. And in a way, who cares? We're coming up with something to fulfill the procurement folks out there, and we don't want to do that with a webinar. Webinars are really about connection and conversation, and businesses are run by people. People are emotional, and so we want to make sure that we can create that emotion and that connection. You're creating something in your webinar that's going to help them, that's going to be positive, that's going to be fun for them. And so let's tap into that positive emotion, and let's not get caught up in that trap of features, because that's kind of goes back to one of the early comments that Bruce made about educational marketing and how it sales. It's because you're helping people, and we want to tap into that emotion. You're glad to do it, they're glad to be there, and ultimately that's going to lead to more business and more happy customers. So I've drone on quite a bit about tone and image and voice. Obviously, that's something that I'm very passionate about because I come to it from the story side. But I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce, because the best way to set the tone early is to build the right team that can really support what you're after. And so, Bruce, I'll turn it back over to you, and you can talk about building your webinar team.
Okay, great. Yeah, tone and image and such is all important because you do want to be consistent with your brand. You can be a little bit divergent and you might push the envelope, but you want to be consistent because you want them to remember who provided this webinar series. Good stuff, Dan. Okay, step number 3 of the 8-step framework is to build a team. And if any of you out there remember the Blues Brothers, I guess that was a few years ago now, Jake and Elwood are putting the band back together with the best people possible. You're building your team with the best people you can get. And the most important thing about the team members is to gain the commitment. You want to make sure that they're really committed above everything else to support this webinar, because there's nothing worse than having a few hundred people out there waiting to hear your live webinar broadcast and not having the support you expected. So who do you need as a team? You should have a webinar manager, a person who owns the project. And this person drives everything forward, uses the checklist, makes sure all the pieces are in place, makes sure people know where and when they have to be certain places. You need to have an owner. Without an owner, you'll miss details and it won't really be successful. You'll need your experts, or an expert or plural experts, people who can deliver that expertise that you agreed to when you did your sweet spot analysis. You may have 1 or 2, or maybe even more. And the expert may or may not be the speaker. It could be you have an expert who puts together the content, but somebody else actually speaks. And that's okay. It's nice to have the expert as the speaker because it's having that expertise in right there on the webinar is great for the question and answer sessions. So you need a project owner, you need your experts, and then you need a speaker or speakers. I always recommend having at least 2 speakers, 1 speaker or 1 person going on through the whole 30 or 45 or 60 minutes. Gets a bit monotonous, and I think people do tend to tune out. So have at least 2 speakers. You could have a moderator and an expert. That's an adequate team. You may have a moderator and 2 experts, but you should have a moderator, someone who keeps track of the time, takes care of asking questions of the experts, and keeps it moving, sort of like a Johnny Carson type person. Maybe who's the newest guy?
Maybe like a Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah, the more modern guy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your team. And it's important, again, to make sure you get that ironclad commitment. I had a webinar once I was putting together for a company. I lined up the expert and I said, hey, John, this is the date for the webinar. We'll have practice sessions the week before. Can you support it? He said, oh, yeah, I can support it. So I said, okay, here's the date. And I failed to emphasize to him the importance that he played in the webinar. So a couple of weeks, luckily it was 2 weeks before the webinar, I said, John, are you ready to go? And he said, oh, I can't do it that day because I have to go see a customer. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. You tell your speakers and the people who are involved with the live broadcast, you tell them the only thing that gets them out of this, or that it's an acceptable excuse to miss it, is if an immediate family member dies or if they die. And that's it. You really have to make that point. You'll need supporting staff too. You'll need at least 1 chat moderator, someone to monitor questions and comments as they come into the chat window that you all see in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You should have a promotion manager, someone whose responsibility is to promote this webinar or this webinar series. Make sure people know about it. Make sure that people register and attend it. And you should have also a post-webinar manager, someone who's in charge of leveraging the live broadcast with the recorded version and getting that out there and posting it on social media and sharing it even internally. Promotion manager and post-webinar manager don't have to be separate people. They can be the same person. And they can also be a chat moderator. But these are the specific support positions that need to be filled to have a successful webinar. And that is your team. Final step that we'll talk about today is the toolkit. And as with any project, whether it's changing the brakes on your car or putting out a knowledge-based webinar, The tools make the project more effective and a lot easier to execute. With webinars, you'll need a webinar broadcast platform, and there's a bunch of them out there. Some of the more common ones, you see their brands here on this slide. GoToWebinar is pretty common. On24, we use ReadyTalk for this webinar. Adobe Connect and Cisco WebEx has a version as well. When you choose a webinar platform, it has to suit your organization and your needs. One thing you don't want to do is you don't want to try to use your existing meeting platform. For example, if you have a GoToMeeting system already, don't try to use that for a webinar. It doesn't have enough tools and support for the registration process, and it usually is limited to the number of attendees who can listen in. You want to look at your budget. Obviously, budget's important. Look at the features. Look at if there's a contract required. Most of them will offer a free trial, so take advantage of that if it's offered. And pay attention to the post-webinar options like follow-up emails and hosting a recorded version, or at least letting you edit a recorded version. And the best webinar packages will have more features where you can do everything in the platform or in the tool, like the invitation emails and the landing page for registration and so on. They're not usually the best, and you don't have the most flexibility, but sometimes it can be more efficient to do it that way. You'll need some tools for promotion, for sending emails before and after. You'll need a tool for registration, especially if your webinar platform doesn't have it, and you'll need tools for metrics. I like to use a marketing automation platform for all those things because the marketing automation encompasses all of those options. Tools like Eloqua or Marketo or HubSpot, for example, or Acton, they all have integrations with the webinar platforms. And they're good for tracking the outbound and inbound promotions, so you know if somebody does sign up for your webinar, what was their source, what did they see. And typically, if you track all those links, you'll see some produced a majority of the registrants, whether it's an email or whether it's some type of an ad or something. And you'll also need marketing automation for tracking your return on investment. If you want to get a tight analysis of did this webinar series actually generate any revenue, you'll need marketing automation and CRM system like Salesforce.com to get that closed loop. In marketing automation, you can roll people into another nurturing program too. Even though your webinar series is in itself a nurturing program, you can roll people into separate nurturing programs where they receive an email or some other type of contact periodically. And you can even tweak it to their specific industry or title, if you like. But you don't have to have marketing automation. You do have to have a webinar platform. You don't have to have marketing automation. You can do a lot with just an email service provider like Constant Contact or MailChimp or ExactTarget, one of those providers. And you don't need to have a CRM integration. If you want the ROI, you do, but if you can get other metrics without that. So think about what you have available already, what you want to purchase, what will suit your needs, and look at the tools that can come together to achieve the objectives that you stated in step 1. If an objective is to determine did these webinars create revenue, and you don't have a CRM that tracks opportunities, you're not going to be able to do it. So think about a balance between tools and the objectives. So that's the first 4 steps of the 8-step framework. And as mentioned, we're going to go through steps 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the next webinar. But I urge you to consider this as a way to build your business in a manufacturing environment. Do something different. Maybe you're one of those manufacturing companies out there who is growing at 1 to 3%, barely keeping up with any type of GDP growth, or maybe you're just struggling to even hold on to the market share. If you're the company in your space that takes advantage of this type of marketing and with educational webinars, you can really grow your business because your other competitors in this space probably aren't doing it because they don't know how to do it. So do something different. You see the quote here in front of you. Albert Einstein famously said, "Insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." So if your marketing plan is to go to some trade shows and place some print ads and run some emails, and you've been doing that for 3 years and your growth has been 1% a year for 3 years, don't keep doing that and expect a different result. Try these educational webinars. So in summary, what we talked about, again, the first 4 steps of the 8-step framework. We talked about the collaboration step, setting the foundation, covering the fundamentals. We talked about the concept, where Dan gave us some good examples of an aviation webinar he worked on. And what face? Remember the face of Dr. Evil? Maybe you can get $1 million from your webinar series. And step 3, choose your team. Make sure you get that commitment. You want to have people who can speak fairly well too. And step number 4, choose the right tools that support your objectives. And Dan, how did we do on the takeaways today?
You know what? I think we did a pretty good job. And this is always, to me, one of the most exciting slides because if we're truly going to be, Bruce, if you and I are going to be sort of true to our goals and to our mission, that's why we want to bring these slides back up and find out, did we do what we said we were going to do? And I think we can say yes to all 3 of these. So let's just run through it really quickly. Hopefully you feel more confident, feel like you've learned a couple things, maybe have a few new ideas now as opposed to kind of where you were maybe 41, 2, 3-ish minutes ago, where you can, first and foremost, I think, learn how to collaboratively develop the topic where Bruce talked about the overlapping circles, finding the sweet spot. And, boy, if that's an area that's something you're interested in learning more about, go back to the first webinar we did where we talked quite a bit about how to do that. And as you pull your team together, that can even be a team exercise. Definitely defining the audience and narrowing down is who we want to talk to, who we want to help. And the more narrow you can get, you can certainly then be more effective in helping them. Metrics, absolutely. We definitely hit on some of those things, and the tools that will be able to help provide those, and even getting agreement on them up front is critically important. And then the resources also to build a successful foundation. And one thing when you're going through the number of those step 1 things, those are the kind of the easy things maybe to skip because it's a lot of the thinking and the planning. But I'll tell you, the success that I've had, and I think, Bruce, you'd probably agree with this too, really starts with building a great foundation. And I not only use it to help as a guide for the team throughout, but as you're building your team and you're going to get leadership buy-in, or you need to get commitment from a subject matter expert, or maybe the marketing leadership needs to buy off on it, or some other resources that you need, a good, well-thought-out plan is the best way to sell in exactly what you're trying to do. When you're clear on your objectives and you're clear on how you want to go about accomplishing them, the rest, it makes it much easier for the rest of the process to kind of fall in line a little bit. So it's a great internal sales tool as well as a great way to keep your team focused. So I certainly feel like we delivered on that one, so I'm going to put a check mark by it. I think I can't find the check marks. Anyway, so definitely did that for number 1. Number 2, learn how to choose the best people for your webinar team. Not only did we talk about that Bruce hit on a lot of those roles that you need, The other thing I would encourage you to think about is not necessarily the people who seem obvious, I guess is what I'm trying to say, may not always be the most obvious. I had a situation where we needed a host, a moderator for a project we were working on, and we were struggling to find one, and then it occurred to the team that, hey, we've got a Toastmasters group that's hosted by the client business. And we went into the Toastmaster group, or went to one of the leaders and said, "Hey, we're doing some content things. We need some moderators. We need some hosts. You guys practice this stuff. You're very interested in being great presenters, great speakers. Would you be interested in partnering with us and perhaps hosting and moderating?" And oh my gosh, the response was a resounding yes. And that just happened a few days ago. So we're just now working into the partnership. But everybody in marketing and everybody in the Toastmasters group is excited about this partnership moving forward. So think outside the box a little bit as you're trying to think about who the best people for your team are. So I think we hit number 2, and then number 3, learn about the tools. Tools are going to be so helpful and so important so that you can not only get the best product out there as far as your webinars go, but that you can really measure and promote and produce really a lot of the webinar. It's not something that has to be so team heavy. You need a good team, as Bruce has outlined, but there are a lot of great tools that will help you there. And I think as you think about teams, not only with the tools that you can get, but behind every tool that you employ, there's going to be another expert, webinar expert who comes along with the service of the different tools that are out there, and they can be a great help with ideas or best practices or advice if you're running into a roadblock. So there's behind every tool that you would employ, there's going to be a person there that can help really expand and grow your team a little bit. So, Bruce, I really think we hit them. Any other thoughts before we move into the questions?
No, I would say we hit them too, and I wanted to emphasize one point you made about learning how to execute and set up webinars. When you're choosing a webinar provider, see if they provide that kind of service. For example, we use ReadyTalk for this webinar broadcast. ReadyTalk has a great blog with all kinds of helpful information about how to execute an effective webinar. So good stuff, Dan.
Great. All right. Well, if I'm looking here, yeah, we've got probably about 5, 6, 7 minutes, something like that, for questions. And as I've been looking over, I think what I'll do is I'll just take them and group them. There's probably about 4 categories here that we can hit very quickly. So the first one is really sort of this notion that metrics are great, good webinars are great, but really to sell them through into my company, we've still got to convert them to leads. That's how I'm going to get this webinar idea sold in. So talk a little bit about conversion, and this was a topic that came up in our first one, and I suspect we'll probably continue through our series, but just talk a little bit about conversion, if you would.
Sure. Conversion obviously is important. That's why you're in business as a manufacturing company, is to sell your product to make a profit, one of the reasons. And so you want your activity to convert to business. And the question is, how does that happen? If you're educating people and giving them information about a pain or a problem, you're not even talking about your product, then how does that convert? Well, the way it converts is that they are appreciative, so you get reciprocity, for one thing, which is a very strong influence. Number 2, you get what I call TOMA, or top of mind awareness. Say you do a series of 4 or 5 webinars. Every time you produce that webinar, you're creating an awareness of the brand. Now, it's important to let people know who's delivering the webinar. You obviously want them to know, for example, that this is by Knowledge Marketing for Industry, or whatever your manufacturing company's name is. You need to tie it to that feeling of reciprocity and for top-of-mind awareness. And the third thing you get by doing this type of webinar is a credibility. Your company knows what they're doing, and they're willing to help you, and they become highly credible in the minds of the audience. And what happens if you chose your audience correctly, then someday they are going to buy what you're selling. So what happens is when the day comes around and they are ready to buy, they think of your brand. They think of your company first. And you already have a leg up on the competition who's still talking about their features and benefits. So you get the call when they do come around to the day they need to purchase it. And that's how it works fundamentally. But practically, you have to make sure that you have that agreement with sales about if they are going to follow up, when they are going to follow up. And you need to get these attendees and registrants through the sales funnel to a position where they are ready to talk. So you have to make it easy for them to find you. And you may want to be a bit aggressive and have the salespeople make some outbound calls to follow up. But you need to make them picture the funnel. We showed that in the first webinar. You have the engagement from the webinars, then you get the top of mind awareness and credibility, and then it comes to a point where they're ready to buy, they call you, or maybe you have a lead scoring program that automatically triggers over to sales. There is a practical aspect as well as a strategic aspect.
Well, and you raise a great point that I think hits on some other thoughts that we're hearing here. Is talk a little bit about the sales funnel, and maybe do you have some examples of some topics that might kind of be a thought starter to start to fill, or to kind of fill the top of the funnel? Do you have some examples of some educational or other topics that we could use as thought starters for our group?
Yeah, I'll talk about the two examples we actually gave in the first webinar. One of them was one I personally was involved with. It was a company that made humidity measurement devices. They spent years with print ads and brochures and promotions about the accuracy and the repeatability and the features and the display and all these different things without getting much traction. So we chose as target audience as pharmaceutical manufacturing companies. They made typical drugs and such, and their pain was that humidity was a very difficult measurement because they did not understand what humidity was, believe it or not, and what affected the measurement. So our expertise was and the sweet spot was in teaching them how to make a better measurement. So we didn't talk about the products in this webinar series. We talked about here's why temperature affects your measurement. Here's why if you're too close to the measurement point, your body will affect the measurement. Here's why you have to wait 15 minutes instead of 2 minutes to get a proper measurement. Those tactics. And that business went from about a 3 to 4% growth rate to about a 20% plus growth rate because of these educational webinars. Another one that Dan talked about last time was passion. General aviation pilots are very passionate about their flying. They love to talk about it. They love to be able to say they're the best pilot that's on the face of the planet. So this company fanned the passion and helped these pilots be better by teaching them more details and more information about aviation charts. There's a couple of examples of topics. Top of the funnel.
Absolutely. Great. And hey, I think we've got one more, and again, we'll just kind of hit it as a higher level topic, but we're probably talking to a lot of folks who either don't have webinars in their job description or are maybe smaller departments who are going to have to really leverage the tools that are out there to help get this done. Can we give folks just a quick sense of if you're going to start shopping around for tools to help not only market but produce and promote and track and measure and all those things, where's a good starting point? How can we help people just kind of take that first step to shopping for some of the tools that are out there?
Yeah, that's tricky because as all marketers know, nowadays there's literally thousands of tools out there for everything you can possibly think of related to marketing. So it can be a bit daunting to choose your tools. One thing you could do is if you're interested in webinars, you should do this anyways, is start listening to other folks' webinars and see how they're done and see what's being done well, what's being done poorly, and so on. And then when you find one that you really like that's really comes across well and the presentation is good and the sound is good, reach out to that person and ask them what platform they're using. You might do that with a few people, and when you ask them about the webinar platform, ask them about the other tools. Say, what did you use to promote it? Did you use a marketing automation platform? Did you have a closed-loop ROI system in place? And ask them these questions. And how did you tie it into the sales team, and what tools did you use for that? So just ask people who seem to be successful in webinars what they used. And I'd be happy to talk about what we use at different tools as well. So you feel free to reach out to me, email or phone. And use some free trials, do some testing, see if it actually works like it's promised, and go to conferences too. Go to a marketing automation platform conference like the Marketo conference or the Oracle conference and talk to folks. You'll get more information than you probably want to hear, but it'll help you move in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my thoughts on that. Dan, did you have any thoughts on that question?
No, sir. I think that's great advice. I'm always a big fan of finding those folks who are doing it well, or if you have a good experience as you're going through your own webinars. I think that's a great point. Just tap into those people. I think content marketing is new enough, and if you were to call a marketing director at a place where you just had a really good webinar experience as an attendee and said, hey, that was terrific, I really enjoyed it, would you give me 10 minutes, 15 minutes to talk about what you did? Heck, you probably get them for an hour. So, no, I think that's a great idea. So, and I tell you what, just in the interest of time, I think let's wrap our questions here. I know we've got just a couple of quick closing slides and maybe a little bit of information about our next webinar. So, Bruce, why don't you wrap it up for us?
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Good questions, everyone. If we didn't get to your question, just send us an email and we'll get back to you. And again, feel free to send those questions liberally. The next webinar is January 29th, 3 weeks from today. We'll cover steps 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the 8-step framework. And I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but you can download the document. It's a PDF document of these 8 steps at webinars.knowledge.marketing. And you can also see the live recording there after a few days. Give me a chance to post it. So I hope to see you there at the next webinar. And if you do like this concept, but you're not sure how to get started, or you don't think you have the resources, or you just need clarification, feel free to check out the webinar toolkit. The URL is here, or give me a call directly at my office, or shoot me an email. I'd be glad to do an assessment. Maybe you've tried a webinar in the past and it didn't work. That's one of the services I offer, is to do an assessment and a review of what could have gone better and so on. And that's it. So thanks very much, Dan, for participating today from Nebraska, and thanks everyone for signing on today, and we hope to see you on the next one.
You bet. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.